On the afternoon of Saturday, September 6, 1997, 19-year-old Brooke Baker typed furiously on a computer in the journalism department at Vincennes University in the small college town of Vincennes, Indiana. Brooke looked at the words on the screen and she felt a rush of excitement. Writing was her favorite pastime. She was a journalist and editor for the university newspaper, but this felt different because Brooke was writing the most important story she'd ever worked on. She finished writing her opening paragraph, read it over a few times, and then exhaled. This was a great start. And she'd secured a major interview in a few days that she knew would make this story the talk of the entire campus when it was done. Brooke loved the idea of having a story that she wrote be talked about by students and faculty. She was only a sophomore, but she already had clear goals for after graduation. She wanted to move to New York and become a writer for the highly prestigious Rolling Stone magazine. But to make that happen, she really needed experience writing major stories like the one she was working on. But in truth, it wasn't the attention or potential accolades that made Brooke want to become a professional journalist. She believed that good reporting and good writing could really make a difference in the world and that it could genuinely help people who needed help. And so that's why she had chosen to write this story in the first place, and why she was now willing to spend part of her weekend alone in the journalism department working on it. Brooke looked down at her watch and saw it was already 3 p.m., later than she realized. So she put her notes in her backpack and got ready to leave. But before she left, she checked her school email. She opened up the first message, and immediately she felt a pit form in her stomach. Then she glanced all around the room, like she thought maybe somebody was secretly watching her, and then she logged out of her email, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and rushed out of the room. Outside, she saw a young man named Steve Hoffman standing by the door with a huge smile on his face. Brooke had long, light brown hair with blue eyes, and today she was wearing jeans and a baggy t-shirt, and Steve thought she was one of the prettiest girls he'd ever met. They'd gone out a couple of times, and Steve hoped they would start going out more often. Brooke smiled back at Steve and apologized for keeping him waiting. He said it wasn't a big deal, that he'd only been there a couple of minutes, but then Steve noticed the worried look on Brooke's face, and he asked if everything was okay. Brooke said, yep, everything's fine. She was just stressed about the story she was working on. And then before Steve could ask any more questions, she took Steve's arm, and they began walking past all the red brick buildings that lined the campus. It was a warm day, almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and a group of students were reclining nearby on the grass, soaking in the sun. The campus was always calm and beautiful around this time of the year, and just walking outside with Steve relaxed Brooke, and so she put the email she had just read out of her mind. A few minutes later, Brooke and Steve turned away from the center of campus onto a small street that had several fast food restaurants on it. Not far away, they could see a bridge that stretched all the way across the Wabash River and led into the state of Illinois on the other side. Brooke and Steve walked into a sandwich place, grabbed some food, and sat down, and before long they were talking about school and also their shared love of movies. And then at some point, as casually as he could, Steve asked if Brooke maybe wanted to come back to his apartment later that night to watch a movie. He said his roommate was going to be out, so they'd have the place to themselves. Brooke told Steve that did sound fun, but she already had plans. So maybe they could hang out and watch movies next weekend. Steve said that would be great, and then they talked some more and finished up their lunch, and then before long, they left the shop and began heading back to campus. And after walking for a little bit, it was time to part ways, and so Brooke thanked Steve again for lunch, and then she walked past the journalism department building and crossed the street to her house. Brooke had chosen this small white wooden house to live in during her sophomore year because it was so close to the university building where she spent most of her time, the journalism building. She also chose it because she could afford to live there by herself. Brooke loved spending time with people, but she also loved having a quiet place to write without any distractions. But tonight was not going to be one of those nights where she wanted total silence and peace because she wasn't writing. Instead, she was going to a party. And so Brooke went inside her house, she dropped her backpack on the floor, and then headed to her bedroom, where she began digging through her closet and laying out clothes to figure out which outfit she was going to wear for the fun that night. After midnight on September 7th, so about 9 hours after Brooke met Steve for lunch, Brooke danced to the music blaring through a small house located just off campus. The party she was at had been raging for a while, and Brooke was having a great time. She'd been really stressed about the story, and this was a good chance for her to blow off some steam. Brooke grinned at the tall young man dancing next to her, and then she wrapped her arms around his neck. His name was Tommy Williams, and he looked at Brooke just the same way that Steve did. He thought she was totally beautiful. And then Tommy asked if she wanted to get out of there with him. Brooke nodded and said, yeah, let's go back to my place. and so the two of them said their goodbyes to some friends, and then they left together. The two walked for a few minutes through town and then eventually cut across the campus, which was empty except for a couple of other students wandering home after a night out. Brooke and Tommy had just passed the journalism department and had begun to cross the street to Brooke's house when suddenly bright headlights lit up their faces and they stopped walking. Brooke turned and saw a campus police officer sitting in his vehicle on the street. Brooke grabbed Tommy's hand and told him to walk fast. And so the two crossed the street the rest of the way and they approached Brooke's house. But before going in, Tommy asked Brooke, hey, what's going on? It's just a campus cop. He's most likely just out here looking for drunk students. We're okay. We're not going to get in trouble. But Brooke would say that the guy in the vehicle was not just a campus cop. He was also her landlord, and he totally creeped her out. She told Tommy that she'd caught her landlord a few times watching her through her window. And not long ago, she had gotten out of the shower one time and walked out of the bathroom wearing nothing but a towel, and he was just standing there in her apartment. She had screamed at him and asked, what are you doing here? And he said he'd just come to spray the house for bugs. He said it was his right to come in whenever he needed because he was the landlord. Tommy couldn't believe it and said that was totally insane. And he told Brooke that she really should go tell the police, the actual city police, not the campus cops, because this guy sounded legitimately dangerous. Brooke nodded but said she really just didn't want to talk about it, at least not right then. And so she grabbed her keys out of her purse, but before she could unlock her door, behind them, both she and Tommy heard the sound of another car coming down the road and slowing down basically right behind them, out on the road. But when Brooke and Tommy turned around, the car sped off. Tommy didn't get a good look at the car, and so he just asked Brooke, hey, who was that? Who would be pulling up in front of your house and then speeding off in the middle of the night? Brooke just shook her head. She didn't say anything, but she actually did recognize this second car. It was Steve's. Brooke secretly wondered if maybe Steve had just been waiting by her house on the off chance she might want to go hang out. Or if maybe he had been following her since they ate lunch together that afternoon. And so between the email she got before she left the journalism department, the campus cop parked in front of her house, and now Steve driving and lurking around her house, it had been a really weird day. But still, Brooke was having a good time with Tommy, and she didn't want any of that other stuff to ruin her night. So she opened the door and led Tommy inside. At 9 p.m. that night, so basically 20-ish hours after Brooke and Tommy went inside of Brooke's house, Brooke's brother knocked on Brooke's front door and called out to his sister. The siblings were supposed to have gotten together that afternoon, but Brooke hadn't been home when he came by. Back in 1997, cell phones were not nearly as prominent as they are now, and Brooke and her brother didn't have them. And so Brooke's brother had tried calling her home, her landline phone, a few times throughout the day, but she hadn't answered. And so now he had just come by her house to make sure she was okay. And so the brother knocked on the door one more time and waited a few minutes, but when he didn't hear anything inside and, the door didn't open, finally he just reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and used the house key that Brooke had given him for her place, and he unlocked the front door. Once he stepped inside, he immediately heard the sound of water running in the bathroom. He figured Brooke must be taking a bath or a shower, so he shouted out to let her know that he was there. But again, nobody responded. Brooke's brother walked down a short hallway towards the bathroom, continuing to call out for his sister, but when he got down the hall, he saw the bathroom door was wide open, and so was the shower curtain, and Brooke wasn't in there. He walked into the bathroom and went straight to the bath, and when he did, he was just confused. The water was running in the bath, and several wet towels were laying in the middle of the tub. He turned off the water and then walked out of the bathroom and headed down the hall towards Brooke's bedroom. He knocked but got no response, and so eventually he opened up the door and walked inside, and right away he turned his head, because the lights were on in the bedroom, and his sister was totally naked, asleep in her bed, and part of her body was exposed. And so Brooke's brother immediately said, I'm so sorry, and he shielded his eyes. And as he was standing there, he didn't hear his sister kind of reacting to his presence, and he knew his sister was actually a really heavy sleeper, and so without looking, he sort of walked over with his head turned away and was starting to cover his sister up with a blanket, to keep her warm. But as he did, he stopped, because something just didn't seem right. He's not looking at his sister, but he can hear her, or more specifically, he can't hear her. He can't hear her breathing. So finally, the brother just turned and looked directly at his sister and also the wall above the headboard, and he just started shaking uncontrollably. And then a moment later, he turned, ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Detective Greg Winkler of the Indiana State Police pulled up to Brooks' white wooden house and parked several feet away from the ambulance that was already out front. The town of Vincennes had a really small police department, and so anytime there was a violent crime in the town, the state police were called. But that really didn't happen very often, and when it did happen, these violent crimes almost never occurred near the college campus, and so Winkler had been very surprised when he got this call. He stepped out of his car and looked up and down the street. It was basically empty, and so Winkler was clearly the first cop to have arrived at the scene. So Winkler walked over and introduced himself, and even though it was pretty dark out in front of the house, Winkler could tell the young man had been sobbing. Winkler eventually asked Brooks' brother if he could please explain what had happened. Brooks' brother told the detective that he and his sister were going to meet up that day, but he hadn't been able to get in touch with her, and so that's why he came by her house. Then he told Winkler about how he let himself in with his own key, and then also what he had seen in the bathroom and, of course, in the bedroom. Detective Winkler thanked him and asked him to please keep waiting outside. Then Winkler walked into the house and found paramedics standing by Brooks' bedroom door. They informed him that the young woman had been dead when they arrived. Winkler nodded and walked into the bedroom. He saw Brooks' body laying on the bed, and right away he lowered his head. He was an experienced homicide detective, but that did not make a scene like this any easier to deal with. Winkler could see immediately that there was blood spatter on the wall behind the bed. He got closer to the body, and he saw multiple wounds on Brooks' neck and chest. There was also blood on the sheets, as if she had suffered wounds on her back as well. Then Winkler noticed the bruising on her inner thighs. The detective would have to wait for the forensics team to arrive, but so far, to him, based on what he was seeing, this looked like a violent murder that had followed a sexual assault. Winkler felt angry. The victim was basically still a kid. I mean, one look at the pictures and decorations in her room made that obvious. He walked into the hall, ready to search the rest of the house, but he saw that several local police and state forensics officers had just arrived. One of the Vincennes PD officers was Detective Bob Dunham. The two men greeted each other. They had worked together before. And Winkler turned around and led Dunham into Brooks' room. Dunham looked at the body and the bloodstains on the wall. He had the same thought and felt the same anger as Winkler. Someone most likely had raped this young woman and then viciously killed her. A few minutes later, the detectives left the bedroom and began to search the rest of the house. They started with the bathroom, where those wet towels were laying in the bath, and then after that, they went to the kitchen and they found the sink filled with water with several knives soaking in it. Durham called out to one of the nearby forensics officers, who then quickly came into the kitchen, and they all agreed at least one of those knives in the sink could be a murder weapon, so the forensics officer bagged up all the knives as evidence. After that, the detectives continued their search of the house, and they didn't find any sign of forced entry, and also they found Brooks' purse and some cash just laying out in the open. So from the looks of it, this didn't seem like a crime connected to a robbery. And not long after the detectives had done this search of the house, the forensics team that was also at the house determined that very likely Brooke had been sexually assaulted before being killed, just like the detectives had thought. The forensics officers also pulled DNA samples from Brooke's body, from under her fingernails, and also from the blood on the wall, and they informed the detectives that they would have further information about what happened to her after processing a rape kit. And so to this point, the detectives felt like they sort of had a good amount of information about what very likely happened here, a rape followed by a murder. A horrible thing, but relatively straightforward. And so the detectives believed they were looking for a man, maybe a current or ex-boyfriend who Brooke knew well enough to let into the house, because again, there was no sign of forced entry. Or if it was not a current or ex-boyfriend, they believed they were still looking for a man, but one who just happened to have his own key to this house. Winkler stepped outside and found Brooks' brother standing with a couple of officers. Winkler walked over to him and asked him to give him a more detailed timeline of exactly where he had been that day and also the night before. And Brooks' brother laid it out for him. When he wasn't trying to track down his sister, he had mostly been hanging out with friends. Now, the police would obviously have to follow up with his friends to confirm his alibi, but for now, they took him at face value, and then Winkler asked the brother if he knew of anybody else, friends, family, anybody, who might have a key to his sister's house. Brooks' brother thought about it and then said he was pretty sure he was the only family member who had a key, and then he also said that he did know Brooks' landlord also had a key. He told Winkler the landlord was a campus cop named Mike Nardine, and he knew that his sister could not stand him. Winkler asked why. Was he just like a bad landlord or something? But Brooks' brother said it was way worse than that. He said Mike used to watch his sister through the windows, and one time he had even let himself into the apartment unannounced. At this point, Brooks' brother looked right at Winkler, and the detective looked back and could see how angry the brother was. And so Winkler, sensing there was more here, asked the brother, is there anything else police needed to know about this landlord guy? And Brooks' brother just nodded. He said he was almost positive her landlord, Mike, had offered to let Brooke keep her rent money in exchange for sex. A couple of days later, Detective Winkler and Dunham met with Mike Nardine, the landlord. Brooke's autopsy report suggested that she had been murdered late at night on September 6th or in the early morning hours of September 7th, and the detectives had learned that Mike, the landlord, was working on campus around that exact time and not far from Brooke's house. Mike walked into the small interview room at the Vincennes Police Department and sat down across from the two detectives. And right away, the detectives could tell Mike was angry. He made it very clear that he did not understand why they would drag a fellow officer in for this kind of interrogation. But Winkler and Dunham assured Mike they were just trying to get a clear picture of what had happened. This didn't seem to make Mike any happier, but he did answer the detectives' questions about his relationship with Brooke. He told them that he was her landlord and that they would talk from time to time when he was doing work on her house or collecting the rent. When there was a pause in the conversation, Winkler just asked Mike straight out if he had ever spied on Brooke when she was in her house, or if he had ever told Brooke she could exchange sex for rent. Mike glared at the two detectives. He said none of that happened, and if he ever showed up at the house unannounced, it was just to do work that had to get done. That was it. At this, Dunham spoke up, and he told Mike, okay, that all makes sense, and then Dunham asked if Mike would submit to a polygraph test and also provide a DNA sample. After all, if Mike was telling the truth, DNA and a polygraph were the easiest ways to prove that. Mike continued to just glare at the two detectives, but he agreed to both requests. And so Dunham and Winkler excused themselves and walked out of the room, and they quickly arranged for the polygraph test and also sent an officer into the room to swab Mike's cheek for the DNA sample. And a little while later that day, after Mike had taken the polygraph, the detectives thanked him for coming in and told him they would follow up if they needed to. Mike just shook his head and walked out of the room. Once he was gone, Winkler and Dunham joined the polygraph examiner, and the examiner reviewed Mike's test right in front of them, and he told the detectives that the results were inconclusive, which meant there was definitely a chance that Mike had lied on several questions, namely about his relationship with Brooke. Investigators knew it was going to take some time to get the test results back for Mike's DNA sample, as well as the DNA samples that were taken from the crime scene. So while they waited, they spent the next several days interviewing Brooke's friends and family to try to get as much information about the college sophomore as possible. And during these interviews, several people vouched for Brooke's brother's whereabouts on the night and early morning when his sister's murder had supposedly taken place. And so Winkler and Dunham did not consider him to be a primary suspect. But just about all of Brooke's friends told the detectives that there were two guys that Brooke had been seeing, Steve Hoffman and Tommy Williams, and she had hung out with both of them on the day before she was found dead. Winkler and Dunham brought Steve into the station first, and after he sat down, Steve kept fumbling with his hands and running his hands through his hair. It was obvious the kid was nervous. But the detectives didn't think that was very suspicious because, after all, he was young and he had just been thrown right into the middle of a murder investigation. Winkler spoke calmly to Steve. He said Steve was not in any trouble, but they needed him to be completely honest with them, even if whatever he had to say might be embarrassing or might make him feel like he was betraying Brooke's trust. Steve nodded and said he would tell them whatever they needed to know. So Winkler started by asking how long Steve and Brooke had been together. But right away, Steve said he and Brooke weren't really dating, they were just friends with benefits. They had started hanging out with each other recently, and they had had sex a few times, but Steve said he really liked Brooke, and he really hoped that their relationship would become more serious over time. Then Dunham asked point blank if Steve had slept with Brooke that past weekend, but Steve said no, he hadn't. He said he met Brooke for lunch on Saturday and asked if she wanted to meet up later that night at his place, but she said she already had plans. After a pause, Dunham leaned in and asked Steve if his lunch date with Brooke was actually the last time he had seen Brooke. And at this question, Steve sort of froze and began to stammer like he couldn't make a sentence. But then he finally said, after their lunch, he had just gone back to his apartment and his roommate, Brian Jones, could vouch for him. Dunham nodded and asked if he and his roommate Brian were both at the apartment the whole day. But Steve said that Brian had gone out later that night, so Steve at one point was at the apartment just by himself. And at this point, Dunham just said, okay, take a deep breath, and I want you to answer the original question. Was lunch the last time you saw Brooke? At this, Steve shook his head, and his face turned bright red like he was totally embarrassed. And he told the detectives that on the night after he and Brooke had gotten lunch together, he had driven to her house and actually parked his car nearby. He knew she had gone out that night, but he thought maybe when she got home, she might want to hang out with him. But around maybe 1 a.m. or so, he saw Brooke walk up to her door with another guy. And when he saw this, he felt this immediate rush of jealousy and anger, and for a second he drove right up in front of her house and then sped off down the street. Dunham and Winkler looked at each other as if they kind of knew that this was a big moment in the interview. And then Winkler turned back towards Steve and leaned in, and he asked if Steve had been angry enough about seeing this other guy to maybe go back to Brooke's house later to confront Brooke about the other guy. Maybe they got into a fight. Maybe things got out of control. At this point, Steve began to get visibly upset. He said he never went back to the house, he really liked Brooke, and he would never hurt her. He had just been stupid and jealous, and that was really it. The detectives let Steve collect himself, and then after a few moments, Dunham asked him if he would provide a DNA sample. And at this, Steve did not hesitate. He said he would do whatever they needed if it would help them find Brooke's killer. Later that week, Winkler and Dunham met with Tommy, the other guy that Brooke was seeing before she was killed, and the interview went pretty much the same way the interview with Steve had gone. Tommy said he and Brooke periodically went out together, and yes, they had slept with each other a few times, but they were not in a serious relationship. Tommy said he and Brooke had been at a party together that Saturday night, then they had gone to her house and they had had sex. He said he left not long afterwards, maybe sometime around 1:30 in the morning, and then he walked around campus for a while and eventually ended up going to his friend's apartment and crashing on his couch. Now, this part of Tommy's story did jump out at the detectives. Tommy could be telling the truth here, but there was a gap of time when nobody would have seen him, so he had no alibi. And that was more than enough time for him to murder Brooke, dump those towels in the bath, put the murder weapon in the sink, clean himself up, and then head to his friend's place. And so the detectives asked Tommy to submit a DNA sample, and he said he would. And then after Tommy had given that sample, the detectives told him that he could go, but that he needed to stay in town. A few weeks into the investigation, the DNA test results from the crime scene and also the results from the rape kit came in, and both provided a DNA sample that the crime lab believed belonged to Brooke's killer. But soon after that, DNA test results came in for Brooke's landlord Mike and from the two guys Brooke had been seeing, Steve and Tommy, but none of their DNA was a clear match to the samples taken from Brooke's body and the crime scene. Now, this did not necessarily mean that, now Mike, Steve, and Tommy are all innocent, but it did mean that police did not have the kind of scientific evidence that would hold up in court. So investigators didn't feel like they had enough to arrest any of their top 3 suspects. And these test results felt like a major setback for Winkler and Dunham. They had become convinced that one of the DNA samples they had secured would match the killer's. And so now they had to totally refocus their investigation and start looking for potential leads that maybe they had overlooked. And as is often the case when a terrible crime takes place in a small community, police began getting lots of pressure from local media, city leaders, and Brooke's friends and family to solve this case quickly. At around this time, Winkler and Dunham made their way across the university campus towards the journalism department. It was hard for them to describe, but even the campus felt like it was full of tension from this case. Like nobody could relax because they feared they might be the next victim because whoever did this had not been caught yet. The detectives entered the journalism department, walked down a long hallway lit with bright fluorescent lights, and found their way to a small office that was cluttered with books. In the office was one of Brooke's journalism professors, who also served as Brooke's advisor, and she welcomed Winkler and Dunham, and then she sat down at her desk. The detectives thanked her for meeting with them, and then Winkler got right into it. He asked her if she knew of any rivalries between Brooke and maybe other journalism students. He told the professor that at this point, the police were looking for anything that might point them in the right direction. Brooke's professor said nothing like that was going on, at least nothing that she was aware of. She said Brooke was very friendly and outgoing and was able to get along with pretty much everyone. She was even one of those rare students who didn't fall into a specific clique and who had friends from all different groups on campus. But then the professor stopped and lowered her voice, and with a very serious look, she told the detectives that actually there might be one group of students that the police should look into. The professor said right before Brooke was killed, she had been working on a story that was going to make a lot of people angry. She was covering an alleged rape that had taken place during a frat party right out on the steps in the front of the frat house. Brooke was set to interview the young woman who was accusing the fraternity brothers, but Brooke had died just days before that interview was going to happen. At this, Winkler and Dunham shot each other a look. This was not anything that Brooke's friends had mentioned. So the detectives got as much information about the story and the fraternity as they could. Then they thanked the professor again, left the campus, and then arranged to search Brooke's phone records and emails. And as they were conducting the search, they quickly discovered Brooke had been receiving threatening emails from members of this fraternity the entire time she'd been working on the story. And one of those emails simply read, "Write the story and you will die." This new lead initially gave a huge jolt to the investigation. Over the next few weeks, police tracked down the members of the fraternity who were directly connected to the story Brooke had been writing, and they secured DNA samples from 10 of these young men, and they interviewed a number of students who had actually been at the frat party in question. However, when the DNA test results came back from the frat brothers, none of them matched the killer's DNA sample. This left Detectives Winkler and Dunham almost at a complete loss. Lead after lead had fallen apart, and it was starting to look like maybe Brooke's killer just had no clear connection to her at all. Over the next several months, the detectives continued to search for new evidence and new leads, but nothing of use surfaced. And eventually, the Vincennes Police Department determined that they didn't have the resources to continue their full-time investigation. So Detective Dunham was pulled away to work on other cases. And then finally, after a year had gone by and still there was no more traction on the case, the Indiana State Police determined that Brooke's murder was now officially a cold case. On July 5th, 1999, almost 2 years after Brooke's murder, Detective Winkler sat at his desk looking over cases that had come in during the July 4th holiday. The phone rang and Winkler answered. Detective Dunham was on the other line, and he was talking so fast, Winkler almost couldn't understand him. But Dunham eventually slowed down and said he was at an apartment in town following up on a missing persons call, and Winkler needed to get there right now. And so Winkler, who trusted Dunham, he hung up, got in his car, and sped across town. Winkler found Dunham waiting for him outside the apartment complex, and then as soon as Winkler got out, Dunham quickly led him into the apartment and right to the bathroom. And Winkler almost could not believe what he was seeing. A pile of wet towels were right there in the middle of the tub, and Dunham told Winkler the bathwater had been running when police arrived at the scene. Then Dunham led Winkler to the kitchen, and the sink was filled with water, and knives were soaking in it. Next, they went to the bedroom, and Dunham showed Winkler the bloodstains on the wall. The crime scene looked almost identical to the scene at Brooke's house, except for one major difference. The Vincennes University sophomore who lived there, Erica Norman, was nowhere to be found. Investigators thought there was still a chance Erica was alive, and so they quickly coordinated with local and state police right across the Wabash River in Illinois, and they launched a 2-state search for her. But 15 days later, on July 20th, 1999, police would find Erica, but she was deceased. Her body was found abandoned in a field on the Illinois side of the river. Back in Indiana, Winkler and Dunham met with several of Erica's friends, and one of them told the detectives that the night Erica had gone missing, she had gone home to watch movies with a guy she knew from work. And when Erica's friend told them who this guy was, the detectives felt a rush of adrenaline, but they also felt a huge sense of regret. They recognized the name, and so now they were nearly certain who had killed both Erica Norman and Brooke Baker. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted over a 2-year period, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Brooke Baker in the early morning hours of September 7th, 1997. The killer sat on the couch next to Brooke. The pair was watching TV, but at some point, Brooke said she was tired and just wanted to go to bed. However, as Brooke began to get up to leave, the killer turned and grabbed her by the arm and pulled her in to kiss her. Brooke shied away and said she didn't want to do that, but the killer just jumped on top of her and then tried to take her clothes off. Immediately, Brooke tried to fight him off, and she slashed the killer's face with her fingernails, and the killer was so stunned by it, he kind of sat up for a second, at which point Brooke managed to jump up from underneath him off the couch, and she ran down the hall. But the killer just ran right after her. He caught up to her, grabbed her from behind, and shoved her into the nearest bedroom. He forced Brooke onto the bed, ripped off her clothes, and then sexually assaulted her. The whole time, Brooke tried to fight back, but she couldn't break free. And then at some point, the killer, who was on top of her, grabbed her by the throat and started choking her. Brooke coughed and wheezed and tried to get air, but the killer kept choking her tighter and tighter until Brooke began to lose consciousness. But the killer let go and climbed off the bed. Brooke was still breathing, but she could barely move. And so the killer ran out of the room, went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife in the sink, and then ran back to the bedroom. Brooke saw her killer rushing back into the room with the knife, and so she used the little strength she had left to turn over on her side and try to pull herself up and out of the bed, but the killer just leapt on top of her again, and he slammed the knife over and over and over again into Brooke's back, stabbing her a total of 11 times. As the killer did this, blood sprayed on the wall, the sheets, and the killer's hands and clothes, and when the killer was done, they climbed off of Brooke and rolled her onto her back. They weren't sure, but they thought Brooke was still breathing. So they raised the knife and stabbed her in the chest. Now, the killer was sure she was dead. The killer climbed off the bed and stood in the bedroom, breathing heavily and trying to collect their thoughts. Finally, they walked out and went to the bathroom. They put the knife down, grabbed a few towels, and tried to wipe the blood off themselves. Then they threw the towels into the tub and turned on the water. Then they picked up the murder weapon, the knife, and went to the kitchen. They filled the sink up with water and then dropped the knife in it to soak. Then the killer walked through the apartment, turned off the TV, then walked to the front door. They opened it up and locked the handle from the inside, and then poked their head out, kind of scanning the street. And when everything looked clear, the killer casually stepped outside, closing the now locked door behind them, and then they took off running across campus back to their apartment. It would turn out Brooke had known her killer well enough to let them into her house, just as investigators had suspected. But the killer was not one of the young men Brooke was seeing. It was actually one of their roommates. At the time of Brooke's murder, Brian Jones had lived with Steve, the guy who met Brooke for lunch and hoped to, at some point, have a more serious relationship with her. And so Brian had met Brooke a few times when she had come by the apartment to see Steve, and, they had gotten along well, because Brooke got along with basically everybody. But Brooke had no idea that in those sparse interactions she had with him, Brian had developed an obsession with her. And so on the night that Brooke would be murdered, Brian went out and just kept thinking about her. And when he showed up at her house later that night, he was determined to have sex with her, whether she wanted to or not. And when Brooke denied him, Brian raped and then murdered her. Brian's name had come up in Brooke's murder investigation, but only in passing. And after 2 years went by, it looked like he would get away with his horrific crime. But then Brian had become obsessed with Erica Norman, another Vincennes University sophomore who had light brown hair and light eyes. Brian knew Erica from work, and just like he had done with Brooke, he decided he was going to have sex with her no matter what. And on that night in July of 1999, he went to Erica's place to watch movies, but then just assaulted and murdered her almost identically to how he had done it 2 years earlier at Brooke's house. In fact, putting the towels in the bath and soaking the knife in the sink was something Brian had seen in a movie and imitated. But this time with Erica, he moved her body to a field across the border in Illinois, thinking that would help distance himself from the crime. But one of Erica's friends knew that Brian had gone to Erica's house on the night she disappeared. And so when Detectives Winkler and Dunham tracked Brian down, they convinced him to provide a DNA sample, and when the results came back, investigators finally got their match to Brooke's killer's DNA. Brian was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years without chance for parole. To honor Brooke's love of writing and her belief that journalists could change the world, the Indiana Collegiate Press Association established the Brooke Baker Indiana Collegiate Journalist of the Year Award, and it continues to inspire young journalists to use their work to help others. In 1971, a 19-year-old Irishman named William began studying physics and computer science at a university in Belfast, Northern Ireland. While he was certainly smart enough to complete the 4-year degree, after 1 year of being in this school, he decided to drop out because he felt like this was not the path he wanted to be on. So he moved back home to a town about 30 minutes north of Belfast, where he got a job as a forklift driver and truck driver for the Guinness Beer Factory. And while he loved this job, he still felt like this was not the path for him. He needed to do something more with his life. And so he decided he would pursue what 2 of his siblings had gone on to do, which was to become a school teacher. He had always admired his school teachers growing up, and he idolized his 2 siblings that had become teachers, and so it felt like the right fit. And so William applied to a 4-year teaching college in Newcastle in England, and after he was accepted, he flew to England, he got set up, and then he began his studies. The first year was great. He loved what he was doing. He did feel like this is the right fit, and he was getting good grades. Everything was going exactly to plan. But then year 2 happened, and everything went off the rails. A requirement to graduate from this 4-year teaching college was all the aspiring teachers starting in their 2nd year had to go teach real students real lessons. They basically had to go to high schools and elementary schools and fill in for the real teacher and give a real lesson, and they were scored on their ability to do that. But all the aspiring teachers knew that when you gave these real lessons to real students, what really ended up happening was the students did not take the aspiring teachers seriously. They viewed them as kind of like substitute teachers, and so they didn't respect them and they didn't listen to them. And so typically, these real teaching sessions just turned into the aspiring teachers desperately trying to calm down their pupils long enough to get them to listen to their lesson plan for just 1 second. But normally it didn't work out, and before long the day was over and nothing was really accomplished. So in William's 2nd year, when it was his turn to go over to a high school and administer his lesson plan, he went over there knowing what he was up against. He did not really expect it to go well, but he decided he would go in there with a positive attitude and he would try to do his best. But as soon as he walked into his classroom, he immediately could tell he was going to be overwhelmed. Everybody's standing up and talking amongst themselves, and they turn around and they see William walking in, and they have this moment of realization that their real teacher is not going to be teaching them that day. It's going to be this substitute, William, and they all kind of gleefully began laughing and joking, and they just turned their backs on William and kept talking amongst themselves. And so William goes inside, he puts his stuff on the desk, and he attempts to get the class to listen to him by saying, "Hey everyone, come on, sit down, time to listen up, I'm your new teacher for the day." But the kids just were not listening. And so finally, William, who was a really big guy, he was 6'4", he was in great shape, he kind of postured himself and then yelled at the class, "Sit down right now." And at this, the class did turn around and looked at William and kind of sized him up, and most of them decided, okay, it's time to sit down. And so 99% of the class goes quiet and sits down except for one kid. It was this 15-year-old boy who was at the back of the room, and he was standing up defiant with his arms crossed, staring at William with a smirk on his face. And all around him, all his cronies were sitting down looking up at him, laughing and kind of looking up at William and laughing at him, knowing that a confrontation was about to ensue. And so William is staring at this kid, trying to get him to just sit without saying anything, and this kid is just mean mugging him with his arms crossed and nothing's happening. And so William walks right up to him and kind of leans over his shoulder and says, "You need to go out in the hallway right now. I will meet you out there." And then William turned around and started walking back towards the front of the room, expecting this to have worked, that this 15-year-old kid would have just followed right along and he'd walk right out to the hallway and that would be that. But when he turned back around again, the 15-year-old kid had not moved. He was still standing in the back of the classroom, arms crossed, staring up at William, basically saying, "Make me." And at this, William lost his mind. He was so mad and so frustrated at how unbelievably disrespectful this kid was being, and really the whole class was being to him, that he just kind of lost it. And he ran up to this kid in the back of the room and he gets right up in his face. And remember, William is 6'4". He's a big guy. And he gets right in the kid's face and he's like, "Get out in the hall right now." And this kid doesn't flinch. Instead, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a knife and he holds it right up against William. And William, without any hesitation, just winds up and blasts this kid across the side of the head, sending him flying over a kid sitting at a desk. He goes flying over this kid and crumples into the corner. And then when he stands up, he drops the knife and puts his hands up and he's like, okay, I'll go out in the hall. And William's like, go out in the hall right now. And so the kid ran out of the classroom, he goes out into the hall, and the whole class is totally silent. No one even wants to look up at William. They're all kind of just looking down at their desk, trying to be as quiet as possible. And William walks back to the front of the class and proceeds to teach the rest of the lesson. As soon as the high school learned that this aspiring teacher, William, had basically knocked out one of their students, even though it seemed like it might have been a little bit deserved, they immediately told the teacher's college, and the teacher's college immediately expelled William. And so now William is suddenly jobless and he's kind of lost again in the world. He doesn't know what he wants to do now because he really had committed to being a teacher. And so he goes back to his home in Northern Ireland and he begins thinking about, what is he going to do next? And he keeps having this thought that he should pursue this thing that he's always been interested in, but he had never taken seriously because it felt so risky. But now that basically everything in his life had fallen apart, he had nothing to lose. So he decided, what the heck, I will do the thing that I've always wanted to do. And that was stage acting. And so he went and auditioned with a local theater company in Belfast. He was accepted into the theater troupe. And then 4 years later, he was discovered performing on stage by a Hollywood filmmaker. And they cast him in a movie, and the rest, as they say, is history. William Neeson, better known as Liam Neeson, would go on to star in dozens of huge movies and TV shows, and he's probably best known for his epic role in the movie Taken, where he is this CIA operative with a particular set of skills, and in this movie, he punches a lot of people in the face, just like when he was a teacher. Our next story is called Crash. Cranbrook, which is a small snowy town in British Columbia, Canada, used to be a place no one had heard of. Then Isaiah Otieno changed that. In 2006, an 18-year-old smiling young man named Isaiah Otieno stepped off of a plane in Cranbrook and began making his way toward the baggage claim. As he walked, everyone in the airport stopped and stared up at him. Isaiah was 6'9" tall, and he was from Kenya, making him easily one of the most unique people in all of Cranbrook. Isaiah, who was the son of a Kenyan politician, had worked really hard to earn his slot at the local university, called the College of the Rockies. His plan was to use that degree to get a great job so he could help support his family back in Nairobi. Not long after the first semester of Isaiah's freshman year had started, he was not only flourishing academically, but also socially. His big smile and his charm and his incredibly good manners had earned him many friends as well as the nickname the Gentle Giant. But the person Isaiah most closely bonded with while he was in Cranbrook was another student named Isaac Hockley. Isaac, in addition to being a student at the College of the Rockies, was also a passionate photographer and actually worked part-time for the local newspaper as a freelance photographer. Isaac and Isaiah had briefly met in late 2006 at their campus's billiard halls when they were both playing pool, but that interaction had not made them friends. What had cemented their friendship and made them very, very close was one night in early 2007, Isaiah had gotten a job as a bouncer at a local bar because he's 6'9", and so he was the bouncer. And Isaac had come to that bar, not to see Isaiah, just to go to the bar. And so Isaiah's at the front, he's checking people in, and then he hears this commotion in the bar behind him, and he turns and he sees Isaac is getting attacked by this huge guy that's way stronger than him, who looked like he was the aggressor in the fight. And so without any hesitation, Isaiah turns and just starts galloping into the bar. He's leaping over chairs, he's leaping over tables, and he jumps into the fray, and he fought off Isaac's attacker. And so after the dust settled, Isaac was so thankful for Isaiah, even though Isaiah kind of downplayed it and acted like it was no big deal. But either way, the experience totally bonded these two very different people, and after that, they became totally inseparable. Over the next couple of semesters, the pair would often go off on long rides outside of Cranbrook into the mountains and the forests, and they would just chat. Isaiah would talk about what it was like to live in Kenya and how he was really here to try to be successful like his father. And Isaac would talk to Isaiah about his passion for photography and what it was like growing up in Canada around Cranbrook. On one very memorable drive, the pair were driving at night along this kind of winding road that went through a forest when all of a sudden a moose leapt onto the road and blocked their way. And so Isaac at the last second had to swerve to avoid the moose. But ultimately, they did not get into an accident and it was just a close call. So Isaac was totally fine. He had kind of recovered within seconds of getting past the moose, but Isaiah, who was in the passenger seat, was totally shaken up by it. And when Isaac started talking to Isaiah about why he was so shaken up, because after all, they are fine, they did not get into an accident, Isaiah would admit that he wasn't shaken up because they almost got into an accident. He was shaken up because he saw a moose. He didn't know moose existed, and so seeing this enormous creature suddenly in the middle of the road right in front of them just had totally spooked him. And so after this, Isaac loved to bring this story up as a way of kind of making fun of Isaiah for his fear of moose, but it was totally in a loving way, and Isaiah would always laugh right along with him. But despite how well everything was going in both Isaiah and Isaac's lives to that point, everything would come crashing down in 2008. On May 13th, 2008, so 2 years after Isaiah showed up in Canada, Isaac got a phone call from his employer, the local newspaper, who told him he needed to head into town to take some pictures of a crash that had just happened. A helicopter had been flying over Cranbrook conducting a power line survey when they had lost power and crashed. And all three people, the pilot and the two people in back who were actually doing the survey, they all died on impact. Isaac, like everybody else who heard about this, was totally shocked. One, because it was totally tragic and horrible, but two, because nothing ever happened in Cranbrook. So to have something so big like this happen right downtown was just unheard of. And so Isaac hopped in his car and he began making his way towards the crash site. And it didn't take long before he saw this massive ring of people right at the intersection between 10th and 14th Street. They were all on the sidewalk and up on buildings, and everyone's just looking in towards this massive mound of jagged metal that was on fire, and all this black smoke was coming off of it. And there's ambulances nearby and police, and the fire department was there, and they're trying to put out the flames, but they can't do it. And so Isaac parks his car and he rushes over to this ring of people and he works his way towards the front. He pulls out his camera and he began taking pictures, first of the wreckage and the fire, and then also of the police as they put tarps over the bodies. Little did Isaac know, these pictures he was taking were about to take on a whole new significance for him. Earlier that day, just before 1 p.m., Isaiah wrapped up his final class of the day, and after he was done, he remembered he had some letters in his backpack that he had been meaning to mail to his family back in Kenya. And so he decided on his way home, he would make a detour to the post office and he would mail those letters. And so he left the building where this final class was and he stepped out into the bright sunshine of that May day. He put his headphones on and then he began to walk. At about 1:05 p.m., he arrived at the post office and he went inside just long enough to put his letters in the mail slot, and then he headed back outside. 1 minute later, at 1:06 p.m., as he was crossing 10th Street, the helicopter above lost power and crashed directly on top of Isaiah. Within seconds, he and the three people on board the helicopter would all be dead. It's believed because Isaiah was listening to music on his headphones, he didn't even hear the helicopter as it was crashing down. He was just walking, and then he was dead. It was a total freak accident. It wasn't until later that day that Isaac would realize the pictures he had taken of this scene included pictures of his friend. The next and final story of today's episode is called Wires Crossed. At around 5:30 p.m. on the evening of August 12, 1944, a young American military pilot named Joe walked out of his quarters on his base in England where he was stationed. And as soon as he was outside, he lit a cigarette to calm his nerves, and as he smoked the cigarette, he began walking towards the huge hangar on the other side of the base where his plane was waiting for him. Joe had been preparing for this night for weeks. He and his co-pilot, a 35-year-old lieutenant who was nicknamed Bud, were about to step off on a top-secret military mission called Operation Aphrodite. And this mission was not only top secret, but it was so unbelievably dangerous that basically anybody who knew about it considered it a suicide mission. But Joe tried not to think about that as he walked towards the hangar. Instead, he tried to think about the reason he was here in the first place, the reason he had joined the military, and that was to defeat the Nazis. And what he and his co-pilot were about to do, Operation Aphrodite, was going to play a huge role in defeating the Nazis. So this was about 5 years into World War II, and at this point, the Nazis were actually losing. However, it was making them more dangerous, not less, because they were becoming very, very desperate. And so they were launching all these outrageous attacks, basically because they had nothing to lose. And one horrible thing the Nazis were doing at this time were dropping these things called vengeance weapons. Hitler called them vengeance weapons. They were basically these huge bombs that the Nazis would drop arbitrarily across the United Kingdom on major population centers. And by this point in the war, these vengeance weapons had killed over 5,000 civilians. And at this exact moment, like this night, as Joe was walking towards the hangar, the Nazis had a stash of vengeance weapons aimed directly at London. That was going to be their next target. And so the mission that Joe and his co-pilot Bud were going on, Operation Aphrodite, was going to be to go out and destroy those vengeance weapons to save London. And as nervous as Joe was about this mission, and he was really nervous, he was also very excited. He actually had volunteered for this mission when many other pilots had done everything they could to stay away from this mission. And on top of that, Joe actually had flown enough missions by this point in the war that he didn't need to fly any more. He could just go home. But instead, he volunteered for this mission. And a reason why Joe might have decided to do that has a lot to do with the family he was raised in. So Joe came from a family that was very successful and accomplished. And his father really pushed Joe and his younger brother to be the very best at whatever they were doing and to be very competitive with each other. And so while Joe and his younger brother did love each other, they also had a pretty intense rivalry. And for a while, Joe's father obviously favored Joe. I mean, Joe was the favorite child, and, his father would always say, Joe's going to be the president someday. He's so talented. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the United States into World War II, both Joe and his younger brother joined the military, and pretty early on in the war, Joe's younger brother got an award for heroism. He had basically saved his platoon of men, and he won all these awards, and he was all over the news. And pretty quickly after that, Joe felt like he fell out of favor with his dad, that his dad kind of looked at the younger brother as being the favorite child now. And so Joe really started to feel insecure and wanted to prove himself really to his dad. And so when Operation Aphrodite came up, Joe volunteered for it really because he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to show his dad that he too could do something huge and change the course of history. And he would change the course of history, but not in the way he expected. And so Joe continued to smoke a cigarette and hustled across the base towards the hangar. And as he did, he found himself kind of speeding up, like he just wanted to get over there and get started. Joe's commanders had given him a special code he would call out over the radio if this mission was successful. It was spade flush. That's what he'd say over the radio. And so as Joe hustled towards the hangar, he imagined how incredible it was going to be to yell out spade flush over the radio. I mean, it was only like 30 minutes away from that moment. This was a short mission. And so finally, Joe reached the hangar and he looked up to the sky one more time to make sure the weather looked solid, because actually they had tried to launch Operation Aphrodite a couple of days earlier, but it had been canceled because of fog. But Joe looked around and the weather looked good, and so he knew it was going to be a go. So he flipped his cigarette butt and stepped into the hangar. Inside this hangar was this massive, big open space, and in the center of the hangar on the floor was this huge plane called a B-24 Liberator. This was, of course, Joe's plane for the night, and so Joe immediately began walking towards the plane to check it out. Now, this particular type of plane was the type of plane Joe had been flying for the past 3 years. I mean, he'd flown many combat missions in this type of aircraft, so he was very familiar with it. But this particular B-24 was unlike any of the other B-24s Joe had ever flown. In fact, this aircraft was so unique, it was unlike any aircraft that any pilot in the American military had ever flown. I mean, this was really a one of one. And so as Joe walked around the outside of this plane, he began to notice some of these unique modifications that the mechanics had made to this aircraft. The most noticeable modification was actually the cockpit. Now, normally the cockpit had all these windows basically all around it, so the pilot could look in any direction and see what was going on, but obviously they needed to be protected from the elements. But this B-24 had all the glass removed except for one pane of glass, basically right in front of where Joe would be staring, just like a single windshield. And so it's almost like it was a convertible aircraft where it was all open air in the cockpit. And the reason for this change is because Joe and his co-pilot, during the course of this top secret mission, Operation Aphrodite, they would have to jump out and parachute to the ground. And so by having this all open, it would allow them to do that much easier. And then another big modification to the B-24 is the guns that were normally located on the outside of the aircraft were gone, and they were replaced by broomsticks painted black to look like guns at a distance. But the visible changes to this particular B-24 were nothing compared to the massive changes that were hidden inside this aircraft. Because the top secret part of Operation Aphrodite was really this particular plane. The plane was not really a plane, it was more like a huge flying bomb. The military's mechanics basically hollowed out the entirety of this plane, removed everything inside of it that was not absolutely vital, and they replaced it with explosives. 10 tons of explosives. Like, this is an unbelievable amount of explosives. A few minutes later, at around 5:55 p.m., Joe and his co-pilot Bud, who by this point had come into the hangar, finished doing their exterior inspection of the aircraft, and then they climbed into the cockpit, with Joe taking a seat in the pilot's seat and Bud sitting in the co-pilot's seat. And even though the evening was cool, both men were visibly sweating. Once the pilots got the go-ahead to begin the mission, Joe fired the first engine and then turned to look at the ground crew all around them, and he noticed all of them looked really, really serious. I mean, they obviously knew how intensely dangerous this mission really was, and the fact was, the pilots might not make it home, and so they're looking up at these guys like, I'm sorry you have to do this. But Joe, he looked out at these people and he sensed that was going on, and so he made a big show to wave and smile at them, to show confidence, like he knew what he was going to do, he's going to be fine. But in reality, Joe really was terrified. By 5:59 p.m., Joe had all 4 propellers spinning on the aircraft, and so he released the brake and began taxiing out to the runway. And as they bumped along, Joe and Bud became really aware of just how heavy this aircraft was from all the explosives. I mean, every bump, this plane is lurching up and down and really creaking and making lots of noises. I mean, this was sketchy. Finally, Joe went full speed ahead, and he and Joe went tearing down the runway, and at some point, the plane did get lift, and it took off into the air. And then just up ahead of him were 6 other planes that had just taken off moments before, who were going to escort Joe and Bud to their target area. Once Joe got the plane to its cruising altitude, he and Bud kind of relaxed for a second and began preparing themselves for what was going to happen next. They had about 15 minutes of just kind of casual flying before the real work of this mission began. The vengeance weapons that Joe and Bud were going out to destroy as part of Operation Aphrodite were located about 120 miles south, just outside of this little town in the very northern tip of France. But destroying these weapons would not be as simple as just Joe and Bud flying over top and releasing all their explosives and flying back home. Because the Nazis had buried these vengeance weapons deep inside the hills in this town in northern France. And so regular bombs wouldn't touch these vengeance weapons. They had to do it a different way. And the way they were going to do it was Joe and Bud were going to fly their plane directly into the hills. And the way they would do this is they would fly their plane as close to the target area as possible, at which point one of the other pilots that were in the escort planes would take remote control of the B-24 flying bomb. And then once they had remote control, Joe and Bud, who no longer needed to do anything, they would jump out and parachute to the ground. And then the pilot who was remotely flying this now vacant B-24 flying bomb, they would just set it on autopilot to crash into the hills. At around 6:15 p.m., just as the English Channel came into view, Joe toggled a switch on his control panel, and then after he did, he and Bud kind of held their breath for a second to see what would happen. And then a couple of seconds later, the plane kind of shuddered for a second and then leveled out. And then a call came over the radio from one of the pilots who were in the escort planes telling Joe and Bud that they had just successfully taken remote control of the B-24. So at this point, Joe and Bud are no longer flying the aircraft. They're just sitting inside of this flying bomb. Now, there were only two things left for Joe and Bud to do before they could bail out to safety. They would need to arm the plane, so basically arm the explosives and make them ready to detonate. And then after that was done, they would need to call out over the radio, spade flush, the code Joe was given, which would signal to everybody else that the plane was ready and Joe and Bud were jumping out. And so once Joe and Bud nodded to each other and kind of acknowledged that, okay, we're going to do the last bit of this mission, Joe turned around in his seat and he looked at this control panel that was right behind him, and on this panel was the arming switch. And so once Joe flipped this, he and Bud would have a very short window of time to safely escape the aircraft. And so it was kind of like, flip it, make the radio call, and get the heck out of there. But Joe and Bud had trained for this moment over and over and over again, so they were ready. And so eventually, Joe flipped the switch, grabbed his radio, and called out, spade flush. What Joe and Bud could not have known when the mechanics were making all these modifications to this B-24 was that one of the mechanics accidentally crossed some wires in putting in all these explosives. And so just seconds after Joe had armed the explosives, they detonated. They were not supposed to, but they did. And so Joe and Bud were killed basically a fraction of a second after calling out spade flush. But it would turn out the catastrophic failure of Operation Aphrodite had no impact on World War II. In fact, Operation Aphrodite should never have happened in the first place. It was totally unnecessary. What Joe and Bud and the rest of the American military didn't know at the time was 5 weeks earlier, the British Royal Air Force dropped a whole bunch of ground-penetrating bombs all across those hills in northern France, and they destroyed all of the vengeance weapons. So when Joe and Bud took off on this doomed mission, there was no threat to London. None. But that is not the big reveal in this story, because Operation Aphrodite changed the course of American history in a really specific and really enormous way. Because Joe, whose full name was Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., was a member of the very famous Kennedy family, a big-time political family in America. And at the time, the Kennedys were all saying Joseph is going to be the next president of the United States. And everybody believed it. He was going to be the guy. But then, of course, Operation Aphrodite changed all of that because Joseph was killed. And so the war would end about a year later, and when it did, Joseph's younger brother, John F. Kennedy, who won that award for heroism and got a Purple Heart early on in the war, and he kind of became a war hero, which prompted Joe to volunteer for Operation Aphrodite. Yeah, John would begin his unbelievable political rise. And by 1960, John F. Kennedy, JFK, would become the 35th president of the United States, even though he wasn't supposed to. He was the second choice. It should have been Joe.
Waren viele 110 Männer an Land, ohne Frauen, ohne Wein und ohne Glanz. Oh, irgendwann erinnerst du dich dann und du hörst noch diese Lieder und du hörst die Musik von damals, die Liebeslieder und die Seemannslieder mit all dem Stolz der Seemännerschichten. Irgendjemand gibt es Frieden, aber dafür braucht es keine Kriegen. Oh, das waren paar peinliche Witzchen, aber die Wälder blühen so wie damals. Die Verwandlung schreitet wieder, auf geht das Karussell.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen.